sensitive kind of approach. So it set its foundation on principles which are more close to sustainable development. But as the idea has not been materialized yet, the projects are not really running into the real world. So we are not also not sure about its sustainability. But still, the topics of healthcare, gender equality, equity, climate and environment, digital technology, these somehow they may have some initiatives which would be more aligned with the sustainable development goal principles. So that is something if from my side.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think sometimes even looking at our ranking really helps us ground that how nicely we're doing in the global landscape per se. Moving back to Michael, so there's debt, there's transparency, there's environment, there's competition between two nations, there's climate change, urgency, and there's also the threat of sort of China. I'm not particularly sure what will happen if when China's GDP will surpass the United States, but it seems like a huge deal, or maybe it will have some political, you can say it will be a political statement. But how do we make sense of this competition? And like Ambassador Mansoor earlier mentioned, how do we not turn it into a competition and use it, or if we consider Pakistan or if we consider South Asia, what do you think what is the kind of situation that we find ourselves in, or what should be the outlook?
Thank you. So my response will tie right into the point that Ambassador Khan had made about geopolitics. Geopolitics is inseparable from this discussion. And indeed, B3W was an explicit response to BRI. And in fact, in many contexts, U.S. officials will be discussing issues related to countering China, like the Indo-Pacific strategy, and not explicitly mention countering China. But in the case of B3W, you've had senior U.S. officials describe it as something that is meant to counter China. So it's very much a response to BRI. And I think that B3W is meant to be a very concrete expression of the Indo-Pacific strategy itself. Now, you all know what the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy is. It is the core U.S. foreign policy in Asia, South Asia, and Asia more broadly, and it is meant to push back against China. It's not meant to contain China. And the way it's been described by one senior U.S. official, a name that's very familiar in this country, Donald Lu, when he was speaking at an event marking the 2-year anniversary of the Indo-Pacific strategy, he said that the idea behind the Indo-Pacific strategy is to provide a better proposition than what China offers. So the idea behind the Indo-Pacific strategy is to essentially provide options for countries that have looked to China for economic and commercial support that are seen as better and more desirable than what China provides. And this was actually initially laid out, articulated by Lu's predecessor, Alice Wells, when she made a speech at the Wilson Center back in 2019. It was the first time that a U.S. official had publicly formally opposed BRI. And in the speech, she was, of course, very critical of BRI and very critical of China, but she also laid out in a lot of detail about how U.S. investments in Pakistan, because she was speaking about CPEC, could be more desirable for Pakistan. So she talked about things like transparency and equitability, and deals and investments that simply work out better for the Pakistani people. So that's what B3W is meant to be from a U.S. perspective, which I think makes it more disappointing that it really hasn't gotten off the ground in terms of concrete achievements. But I don't see how you can separate from the broader U.S.-China competition. And we know that great power competition is the big, or one of the core foreign policy themes of the moment. And U.S.-China competition is the core manifestation of that. I think that we've never seen a more intense competition between the U.S. and China than we're seeing now. But I would come back to try to look at this with a glass half full. I'd go back to one of the comments that was made by the opening speaker, which I believe she noted that climate change, concerns about climate change and fighting climate change are goals, are interests of both the US and China. And I think it's important to remember that the Biden administration, including President Biden himself, have specifically laid out areas where they would like to see cooperation with China. And climate change is one of them. There are, I think, 5 or so. And when President Biden was still a presidential candidate, he published an article in Foreign Affairs where he laid out these issues that he thought deserved cooperation with China. He talked about climate change, he talked about non-proliferation, global health, and some others. But that brings us back to an important question: is there space for the U.S. and China to actually talk through these climate issues, right? And just a very brief anecdote. I'm sure many of you are familiar with John Kerry, Senator John Kerry, who had been appointed as the climate change czar in the Biden administration. It was the first time you'd had a position like this. It was a very important position, so important that it was housed on the National Security Council. So according to some reports that came out soon after the Biden administration took office, John Kerry actually made a pitch to the president that basically the competition with China be put on hold so that the U.S. could pursue climate change talks with China, which I think is a very ambitious proposal. As we know, he was not successful with that, Kerry. But I think it's important to keep that context in mind, that maybe there could be scope for Beijing and Washington to discuss these issues. Final point, very briefly, you had mentioned debt trap diplomacy. It's become one of these big catchphrases that so many talk about. And I think it's important to put out there that this is contested. There are many that argue that there's no such thing as debt trap diplomacy, that it's something that harsh critics of China come up with. And I think there's something to be said for that, in the sense that if you look at, in a South Asia context, the countries that are receiving loans from China and they're indebted, in many cases, including Pakistan, China is not the top source of debt, right? So in Pakistan, for example, when you look at Pakistan's public sector debt, the greatest percentage of that has come from public companies, from corporations that are hemorrhaging debt, like PIA and so on. It's not Chinese loans that is the biggest reason for that. It's the same with Sri Lanka. When Sri Lanka had its horrible economic crisis some years ago, a lot of critics of China were saying, "Oh, this is Sri Lanka's decision to take on so many loans from China. That's why it's indebted." There were a series of economic policy mistakes that the government in Sri Lanka took over many years that contributed to the debt even more. So I just wanted to put in that caveat about this term.
Fantastic, thank you. So I think we are running out of time, so I would just pose just two questions, and these are somewhat related to the topic under discussion, and then we will open to the audience for question and answers. So you have traveled Pakistan, and Ambassador Mansoor has also traveled across Pakistan and also to other countries. I'm sure Dr. Atif, with his interest in transportation, has done so as well throughout Germany and so on, Germany and Europe in particular, I should say. There is often a misunderstanding of the rural environment. People say that rural is urban in the making. When we look at Pakistan, when we look at its economy, when we look at the people and the opportunities that we have, and if we consider the low-hanging fruits, agriculture, we just can't miss agriculture as one of the key sectors, and also one of the sectors that we have the infrastructure for, we have the technical capabilities to expand on, and agriculture invariably will become part of either B3W or BRI, and so on. And it will, of course, it will be one of the first sectors to be integrated in the export industry as well. While we are catching up on the technological transfer, we are catching up on the modern technology and so on, if we are ever able to do so. But I think agriculture does remain as they say in the textbook, the backbone of Pakistan. How do you think we can further develop our rural areas without really urbanizing them. And we leave behind this sort of notion of developing skyscrapers, of developing, we don't particularly have a skyscraper, but at least mid to high rise buildings, and thinking about these motorways and these, cities that are full of cars and so on. And this is open to all the panelists, and we can have a brief comment on this question, and then we will open for questions and answers. Please feel free to answer, anyone.
I think it's fact, and we should acknowledge this fact that Pakistan, from the beginning, for past 75 years, has not invested in its people or people-centered governance or people-centered development. As a result of that, you are right. Rural areas, rural section of the economy has been neglected. Rural sections of the economy in the developed world, whether it is America, whether it is Europe or Japan or any other parts of the world, rural sections of the economy are really strong contributors to the economy, because the governments invest there in agriculture, governments invest there in education, governments invest there in skill development, and an economy is created wherein the people don't have to migrate to urban centers. People will continue to migrate to urban centers, as is happening in Pakistan, because facilities have not been created, not been provided at the doorsteps to the people in rural areas. So I think there is no shortcut. We have to make this change in the policy making, change in the governance system. We have to invest in our rural economy. We have to, whether it is a vertical construction or whether it is a horizontal planning, but we have to invest in rural sectors. Our morning panel discussion was about education and skill development. Pakistan has, as I already stated in my earlier intervention, that overpopulation or population growth rate is a big problem, and when you look at other socio-economic indicators, education or literacy rate is one of the lowest in the regions. So I think with a country of 250 million people, unless and until we address these basics and fundamentals of our economy, fundamentals of the if I mean for running an elitist economy, and the problems will remain unresolved. There is no rocket science about it. I have been part of the governance system for past 35 years. We have not been able to bring a change, and the younger generation obviously blames us. But I think there is no other way to change this scenario. We have to invest in our people, invest in the rural economy, invest in the education, invest in skill development, invest in agriculture, and invest in a manner which doesn't hurt the climate. So that is only, in my view, the solution.
Uh, to me, there is a other side of economic development at macro scale. CPEC actually ensures or claims that there will be economic development at macro scale. But what about micro scale? Our local industry is actually quite damaged because of the easy import from China. And I fear when the CPEC will be swinging in its full capacity, we might be eating Chinese ginger, Chinese onion, and each and everything from China, because it might be quite cost effective.
Thanks. All I would add is your question is essential, and it's not just a hypothetical. I think that agriculture, as we all know, is incredibly vulnerable to climate change, and agriculture will be decimated by climate change. And if you look at, just the flood example that you mentioned a few years ago, the catastrophic floods, looking at the catastrophic damage to agriculture and the broader impacts that had on the Pakistani economy, such as having to increase food imports, it's very clear that this is something that policymakers are going to need to grapple with sooner rather than later. And indeed, as I understand it, Pakistan has experienced significant levels of urbanization in recent years, but you still have a significant majority of the country, and I believe a significant majority of workers in rural areas. Agriculture continues to be one of the biggest sources of employment, right? And yet, climate change it's a clear and present danger. It's upon us. So I would certainly echo what Ambassador Khan had to say about the importance of increasing access to rural public services, not just education, but also healthcare. This is essential. This is, I think, one of the main reasons why, I mean, there's so many reasons. One reason why Pakistan's economy has struggled over so many years is, you could talk about unemployment, but you could also talk about not enough workers, so to speak, not enough skilled, educated, healthy workers. And yet, as agriculture will suffer more and more from the effects of climate change, you're going to need to develop new sectors, and you're going to need employees to fill those sectors. And again, I think this is not just a hypothetical, it's playing out in real time.
Absolutely. I think another very important discussion that should be equally prioritized as much as climate change in Pakistan is the issue of food security and malnutrition. But that's a discussion for another time, perhaps. Now we will continue with questions and answers from the audience. And after that, we will have the closing remarks. So the floor is open. And I encourage the participants to please continue asking questions. We'll collect 2 to 3 questions. And if you have a direct question for any of the participants, please do mention their name and briefly introduce yourself before asking the question. Thank you. So, do we have a mic?
Hi, my name's Hamza. I'm an assistant professor at ComStats. My question is more perhaps to the ambassador and to Michael. Sustainability has generally become a buzzword. I'm glad that right now when we're talking about it in the context of environmental sustainability with economic sustainability, political sustainability, and cultural sustainability as well. In this regard, though, do you not think that now that the idea of global environmental sustainability becomes more of a hindrance to countries like Pakistan for their economic sustainability? So, for example, countries in the West, in Europe, the US, even countries like China have had a long period of time where they had their industrial revolution. These things have majorly contributed to the economies that they now have. These are all things that have majorly impacted environmental sustainability globally. And so then the concept of equity also plays in that, with Pakistan having maybe 1% contribution to global warming, is then impacted by global policies of environmental sustainability that can impact them or us, essentially, achieving that economic sustainability which we want to. Because the path to economic sustainability seems now to run through industrialization. And so projects like the B3W that want to create more of a global idea of policy on how we should perhaps have our industries set up, does that not then prevent or slow down at least economic development for countries like us? And in that regard, maybe a second part to that would be that maybe it's an extra challenge that a project like B3W faces compared to the Belt and Road Initiative is maybe slightly the conspiracy theorization, I would say, or the mistrust people have of the West and the idea of climate change with that, right? Where it is seen as maybe more of a Western concept in the masses that we have around us. And so how do you then tackle that as well when it then impacts people's economic sustainability?
Could you please tell us who this question is directed to in particular?
This one would probably be to Michael, perhaps to the ambassador as well.
Right. So to sum it up, it's basically there's history. The Western civilization has developed itself, and now it's time for our development, but we can't develop. And we don't contribute much. And now what do we do with this situation when they talk about sustainability and ask us not to burn coal? Because in a country of 220 million, if we start burning coal, the whole world will be fried.
Thank you. I think that that's such an important question, and it gets to the crux of this notion of climate justice. And in that regard, I think that we need to bring attention to the major achievement at not this most recent COPE conference, but the previous one, when you had an agreement on a new loss and damage fund, and of course Pakistan was chairing was it the G8, the G77 that negotiated that deal, led by Sherry Rahman, the climate change minister at the time. That was a huge deal, and it showed that the West, or I shouldn't say the West, that the developed countries of the world are at least receptive to the idea of something like that. But to be very honest, when it comes to the U.S. Congress and many legislatures in Western capitals, maybe a lot of reluctance to agree to significant amounts of funding to provide to developing countries for climate change mitigation adaptation. It's unfortunately a very sensitive political issue in many Western capitals, unfortunately. But at least I think it's important to flag that achievement. But I don't really have an answer to the question. You're very right that it is, on a very basic level, unfair in the sense that the industrialized world polluted for many years to build up its economy, and now the world has evolved to the point that climate change is so much more serious than it was decades, hundreds of years ago, when the industrializing countries were polluting away to build up their economies. And it's true that the global South doesn't have the luxury of doing that. I would bring some attention here to the position that India took several years ago at COPE. India, of course, has long seen itself as a leader of the global South, though China, of course, has a claim on that as well. And I can't remember what year it was specifically, but there was one year when Modi, when he was making his statement, he sort of veered away from what had been the typical, the customary Indian position, which I think reflected the broader global South position, that it's not fair to be pressuring us to be focusing on emissions given what happened. But he sort of moved away from that position, which I think was a recognition on the part of some countries that that position might have to change just because of necessity. But I don't have a good answer to the question. There is a level of injustice. I think the term climate justice is a fair one, even though some in the West don't like that term. But how to get around that is the important thing. And that's where the issue of climate change negotiations are essential, why these COPE conferences are so essential, why it's important for the world's biggest polluters, including the US and China, to be talking about these issues. So I would just say that. In terms of the other question about whether a potential disadvantage of B3W is a sense of mistrust on the part of many countries, I don't necessarily know about that. There's certainly a lot of mistrust about the West, but I think that climate change is something that's, I would argue that there may be more climate change deniers in the West than in the global South. And again, that's because in the global South, it's playing out so much more vividly. You have such huge levels of vulnerability, and it's important and it's impossible to avoid and ignore and not be aware of just how real of a threat that is. Whereas in the US, I think there is more of a luxury for some people just to wave it off as some type of weird conspiracy theory, which is a very dangerous thing.
I think after the formation of United Nations in the subsequent decades, what happened was that this international discourse evolved into two blocks, as Michael has also used the term South and North, or developing and developed countries. And there they, developed interesting jargons which have become a constant part of this discourse. Developing countries would say that developed world industrialized world has caused a lot of damage to the universe, to the world, in terms of colonization through climate, through pollution caused by industrialization, colonization, and such other things. And they have been demanding some kind of compensation from the resources of the developed countries to be contributed towards developing countries. And developed countries in counter argue that developing countries have not been focusing on sustainable ways of development, environment, and all that thing. I think the truth is that countries have to develop from their own resources, have to develop through their own will. Similarly, countries have to take care of their environment for their own nation, for their own needs, for the better future of their coming generations. Justice is not given to you by anyone. Justice has to be achieved by the society in the country. So I think we should not go on the jargon. If Pakistan, say, adopts policies which focus on people centered development, industrialization, economic growth, and also take care of environment, because we cannot today start from to go into a development process that continues to pollute the country and cause environmental damage. It will be a crime against our coming generations. So I think the important thing is that we have to focus on addressing development issues, addressing environment issues, and also interacting constructively with the international community, forming partnerships with the US, with China, with every country wherever we need.
I think that's an interesting observation, but I will add to it that there was this while we have smog for like 3-4 months in Lahore. There was also this case in Delhi where the judge of the Supreme Court actually said that I can't make the farmers in Pakistan stop burning crops. So that climate knows no boundaries. So that is also, while there is an aspect of climate which focuses on our internal sort of production and also expenditure of energy related to, let's say, switching to Euro 5 fuel or having like solar powered energy generation, it is also very important that you can't, it is also important for your neighbor to be considerate of what they are burning. Any other questions?
Hi, so my name is Mohammed Hamzar Fakat from fourth year, and one of the things that I realized is that we're not necessarily allowed to really go to agricultural fields or have that easy of an access towards them, and the farmers that are present right now, they don't necessarily accept new ideas or new ways of trying to make agriculture more efficient. So I would say that like one way of being able to do things and kind of even understand climate change in Pakistan, if there are like more public spaces and students are allowed to, or like promoted to visit fields or understand what agriculture is, then that would be beneficial in the way okay, we can implement technology into the agriculture, like growing agriculture, and kind of understand how we can make it more efficient, and like use maybe things like drones to make spread the water more efficiently, or make it so that like even like if there's like a day-to-day climate change, and we can understand places that are even in rural villages and understand, and have like some kind of documentaries made so that even the people in the rural areas could be understanding what they are going through and what is coming towards them for the future, so that as a nation we can understand what climate change is going to lead us into. Like the media right now for the general public is the social media, and the more we can spread this information to all of our generations, the better it is. So what are some ways we could do that, or maybe as students be allowed to do things as such?
Um, can we have one more question? Yes, please. I think this is an important point that you've raised, and it essentially has to do with something that we were even discussing in the morning when Mr. Aurangzeb actually pointed out about the access to internet in the rural areas, and then the technological transfer learning and the sort of integration of technological equipment such as drip irrigation and so on in the agriculture sector. Yes.
Assalamualaikum. My name is Awab, architecture fourth year. So my question was for Mr. Michael. You started your opening remarks with the emphasis on the superiority of B3W over BRI by saying how one was owned by a democratic country and the other being owned by an authoritarian one. But as far as the past 6 months have shown, like there's neither a difference between democracy or authority. Just the US is just better at faking it. So the question then boils down to who actually just owns the trade route. Like it's just a race between the global powers. The US doesn't really want to allow anybody else to own it. It can certainly not allow China to become the global power. The economy would run through China then. So the entire conversation then it refutes the concept of climate change, because I don't think the US or China, for that fact, would actually care at all about climate change. It's more like a race between who wants to rule. So I think the climate change talk only becomes like something that looks good or sounds good on paper. Uh, and so my question then becomes, uh, do like global projects or mega projects actually have any effect on climate change, or is it more controllable by small scale developments on a private level?
I think that's quite a poignant question, but I'm sure Michael did not address it in such a harsh manner. But I think the question that you're trying to ask has to do with sovereignty and these transnational developments. And I think it's a very important question because this phenomena is already in play. We can look at the Suez Canal, for instance, operated by the French, and it is in a different territory. We can also look at the Hambantota Airport, and the 100-year lease program of it. So once you're operating in another territory which is sovereign on its own, but now you own the assets, the geographical asset in that, or the strategic asset, as you may call it, in another country. So how do you reconcile the concept of sovereignty and also investment, and then these 100-year lease programs and so on? I think we can take one more question and then we can ask our panelists to please respond.
Suleiman Mirza from fourth year. And the question I'd like to raise is that what lessons can Pakistan learn from other countries' experiences with BRI projects and B3W projects, and how we can use those as an example to mitigate risks, maximize the benefits, and basically improve and safeguard our own national interests while fulfilling the initial requirement of those particular initiatives. So in particular, I just like to see what prominent examples or models that Pakistan can follow that have been the most successful and would be most relevant for our future interests.
Great. But just so you know, CPEC is the flagship project of BRI. So we don't particularly have the first one that goes through the wall always gets bloody. So with that, I think we can open it up to the. Please feel free to comment as you may.
I think I'll start with this last questions, that what are the lessons learned from BRI and what particularly we can learn from the success of any BRI project anywhere else in the world. I think the best learning model for us is actually the CPEC, because CPEC, no other BRI project has uh, made progress consistently for 10 years. CPEC, despite many issues, it has made progress in many components of it for consistently for 10 years. And a large amount of roads and infrastructure development has taken place under the CPEC project. The problems or the impediments which have been faced by Pakistan in taking forward this project, or particularly the areas where progress has not been made at that level, such as special economic zones, it is actually basically partly the fault of Pakistan, partly because of the security environment, which is maybe to some extent beyond our control, but we have not been able to make desired progress in SEZs. And in terms of security also, you have seen that Chinese workers, professional engineers have constantly been targeted by the terrorist elements, and somehow the security provided by them to them by Pakistan has not been foolproof. So I think lessons for Pakistan in terms of BRI, in terms of CPEC, because the next 10 years CPEC, Pakistan's vision has been to extend CPEC in north to Afghanistan and to Central Asia in our northwest. If we have to achieve that, we will have to ensure that CPEC makes progress, considerable progress, significant progress within Pakistan first, and then as situation improves in Afghanistan in terms of the ground situation in Afghanistan and relations with Pakistan, then the CPEC can be extended to Afghanistan and Central Asia. I don't have actually any other country. Maybe Michael or Gamaz, you know about any other country from where a BRI project can be quoted as a model. We can, I think, look into that. But I think we already have a lot of experience in seeing what has gone right with the CPEC and what has gone wrong with the CPEC, and we can address that.
So thank you. Yeah. So to your question, yeah. So I didn't use the word superiority. I wouldn't want to imply that B3. I mean, how could B3W be superior? There's really nothing to it on concrete levels. It's a vision. Whereas BRI has all kinds of success stories because there's actually been projects, so many projects implemented, certainly here in Pakistan, but also beyond. My point was that the way that each the comparative advantages, that's the comparative advantage, that's the term that I used. But point taken. So I would say this, that China view climate change very seriously. And absolutely, it's true that both the US and China continue to engage in policies that are very polluting. And, China continues to use coal very heavily, just as India does, for that matter. But if you look at over the last few years, if you look at the balance sheet on major US and Chinese investments overseas, they've taken a major turn toward the greener, so to speak. So I don't remember if this was mentioned earlier, but some years ago, China's government announced that it was no longer going to invest in coal projects abroad. And I think that's still in play today. Whereas the US, and this is something I think that's been particularly noticeable during the Biden administration, so many of its energy investments overseas have been focused on clean energy. So, DFC, as I think I had mentioned earlier, it's pretty much fully focused on clean energy investments. And there have been a series of investments announced in India. The DFC is looking into options in Pakistan. There's some others elsewhere in South Asia as well. So I do think that both countries take climate change very, very seriously. Just one more broader point on geopolitics. I think it's very important to keep the broader context in mind. We talk about how B3W was a U.S.-led response to BRI, but let's not forget that at one point during the early years of BRI and CPEC, the U.S. supported both, right? You had David Hale, the ambassador to Pakistan at the time, who gave a series of media interviews singing the praises of CPEC and saying, we look to the day when the U.S. plays a part in it. What was different, of course, was that back then, U.S.-China competition wasn't what it is now. It's only when that great power competition intensified, when you had the Alice Wells speech and everything following from that. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. If U.S.-China competition were to recede, which I don't see happening anytime soon, I think that you may have a very different reaction from the U.S. government toward BRI. And final point that I'll make, and again meant to mention this earlier, bringing things back to the U.S.-Pakistan relationship, climate change is actually a growth area for cooperation in the relationship right now. If you look at some of the newest initiatives in the bilateral relationship, they revolve around climate related issues. There's something called the Clean Energy Alliance Framework, Green Alliance Framework. Sorry, Ambassador Blom frequently talks about this. There've been a number of initiatives tied to it. It's not only unique to the relationship with Pakistan, others too. This is something that could be impacted depending on the outcome of the presidential election in the U.S. next year. I'm not sure President Trump would be as inclined to focus so heavily on climate change in the relationship with Pakistan or in foreign policy more broadly. But I think it's important to keep in mind that these clean energy issues, climate issues are actually a big part of the U.S.-Pakistan relationship today. Thank you.
Okay, just to one question about rural areas production. Our northern areas in Pakistan, they are really facing disturbed food production patterns due to climate change. And the food production, whatever is available there, is under serious pressure, you may say that. And what on the other side, CPEC and the associated infrastructure with CPEC, what it is doing, it is bringing more and more tourists every year to those areas, even the far-flung areas, which were not really previously really accessed by the mass scale movements of or mobility by the people, but that is happening right now. So those areas which have limited supply of foods, they are also experiencing quite extra burden because of these added infrastructure, for which I think we are not yet ready to handle it. Our major response, most of the time, it remains reactive, not responsive. That is the issue which we have to take into consideration.
Any other? Perfect. Thank you. I think I will just add one more comment that, as Michael mentioned earlier, CPEC, not just CPEC, actually, including CPEC, actually, all of the BRI projects are actually slowing down. And there are countries that are actively backing out of it. And most of it has to do with transparency because China is not part of the Paris Club. The lending practices are not transparent, and we are still not sure how this burden will actually translate, or what are the conditions at which what are the conditions at which we are actually receiving these loans. In terms of infrastructure, what is going to be the return on investment? We are not particularly sure on that. We still have even the public, you can say, transportation projects. We are still we still have to incur a lot of subsidies on those. Government has to offer subsidies on those projects, and the long-term sort of sustainability, at least just the fiscal sustainability, let alone climate and so on, that is still fluid. So we're not particularly sure who to look up to as a country. And considering the kind of global arrangement that we are entering into, where cities are going to be important, ports are going to be important, different countries will be operating in different territories, and their sovereignty will be challenged. And in the midst of all of this, I think the story or the challenge of this generation that I find is going to be climate change. So how are we going to make sense of it? If we are still alive, I think we'll find out. So now I will invite Muhammad Umar Farooq to please offer closing remarks, and thank you all for your time and patience.
First of all, I want to thank you, the esteemed panelists, Michael Kugerman, Ambassador Mansoor Ahmed Khan, Dr. Atif Belal, for participating in this an interesting conversation. And as far as I know, we have a representative from Khan here. And because Khan are the main stakeholders in the CPAC project, because it's located in the northern areas, and this is from the CPAC will enter from China. And I think this is probably the most vulnerable area. Interestingly, these days I was looking at a good definition for justice. And so I was going through this book, Republic by Plato, and he said the justice is to mind your own business. So that was very interesting. I started applying in everything that was wrong in our country, and it was perfect. But honestly, I just realized that it doesn't apply on the climate change, global warming, but because you just cannot mind your own business. This thing about the fog, we Pakistanis love to create our own small battles. Like we have this kind of a battle with India, who's, responsible for the smog in Lahore. They blame us for using the Euro 2 fuel. We blame them for burning crops. We don't realize that fog is just getting denser every year. And, it's not helping anyone out. So, either we are really blind to the problem, and I think this is something that we need to all work together. Second, I was going through the biography of Genghis Khan, and the word of the Silk Route came there. I think this is something that a lesson needs to be learned back from the history, that why Silk Route was so successful. Somebody may say that, well, it was not a nation state type of environment that time. They were bigger empires. But we all know that the empires were very fluid, and there was a lot of tribes and interwar going on, but it just became very successful because of the supply and demand. Are there any lessons that we can learn from it? And if we stop looking at CPAC as a network of roads and change it with the networks of interests, I think this is something that will clarify more important. When we talk about the CPAC versus the Build Back Better, so we also see there is kind of a two camps, because the G7 is primarily behind the other initiative. So there are these divisions, and obviously there are financial interests, but I don't see any issues when these network of communications start helping everyone in the world. As you said before, that the US, and I remember that part, that they were looking forward to CPAC, and there was one time there were conversations about US being start investing in the CPAC, and obviously the dynamics eventually changed because of the Indo-Pacific and the China-centric policy. So problem with the CPAC, and our esteemed guest, while in the opening remarks, talked about the Green CPAC initiative. Honestly, no one in Pakistan knows what that Green initiative is. We don't even know what is happening in the CPAC, because there's the issue of the transparency. How many of you know that what is happening in the Gwadar airport? We as the architects, we are in this habit of finding all the great projects in the country that's happening. We go there, and you know about the architects, whenever they go, they start taking 100 photographs, start feeling the finishes. People think they're crazy. But don't you find it interesting? No one knows exactly what is happening at the Gwadar airport. So there is definitely this major issue of transparency. And the second thing that comes in is the idea of the feasibility. And I'm sure China has done a complete feasibility, like this thing about the game theory, and you test different scenarios, that what will go wrong. If there's a problem in the Pakistan, what will happen? If there's a problem in another country, Afghanistan, what's going to happen? So considering China, I'm sure they have taken all these factors in consideration, and even if the CPAC fails, they probably be fine with it. But unfortunately, we Pakistanis, we have not done any long-term feasibility studies, because unfortunately, a lot of things are running on the ad hoc basis. So even if this idea of the debt trap is real, cannot blame China for it. If we don't understand that the dollar is, the rupee is going through the devaluation, the economy is not going good, the terrorism is going to have a problem, because you have to pay back the interest anytime. So I think we are to be blamed for this thing. And the important thing is that really, I would like to know more about these green initiatives, about the CPAC, because this was actually a new thing for me. Second thing, people like to take optimistic approach. We architects like pessimistic approach, like also to look at the darker side of the things, because somebody said in the latest research that you cannot stop global warming. You cannot stop the climate change. So what is going to be the next strategy? Next strategy is going to be how to survive the climate change. So we were talking to our colleagues at the TU Delft University, Netherlands, and they came up with a very interesting term. That was extreme architecture. So I think we, as a caution, need to consider the worst case scenario, that what the things are not going to come back to normal. And I feel that our coming generations, some of them are sitting here, they are going to be living in a different world, for better or for worse. And they will have a lot more challenges that are going to come their way. So maybe the whole idea of these new initiatives, either the US-led Build Back Better World, or China-led BRI, need to factor in those challenges because uh, I don't think that putting solar panels or running EVs and doing those things is going to have any significant impact. The floods will be there, the fires will be there, droughts will be there. Michael, you're probably enjoying a very nice April here. The Aprils are not like that pleasant. So, by the way, there's another rain coming in next week. So this is actually an anomaly. Um, the So, with that, I just want to say one last thing, and that is that what happens after these panel discussions? Okay, we have a good discussion, then we all go home, and then we forget about it. I think, considering that the BNU now has a policy unit, I think we should try to summarize some of these points and try to engage government. They say that you should not go silently into the dark night without making some noise. So let's make some noise. Let's publish some policy papers or our observations and share with the government, and then just wait if we can get respond to it. I think this is the best we can do. Thank you very much.
Thank you once again to our esteemed panelists, and thank you all for joining us.